Joining me today is Dr. Tino Sanandaji. Tino is an economics researcher at the Stockholm School of Economics, Sweden. He's originally a Kurd from Iran who moved to Sweden at the age of 9 and has written extensively about immigration policy. Tino, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I'm very excited to talk to you because I have been harassing you for about 6 months on email. Everyone said, I've mentioned on the show a couple times, I want to talk to someone in Sweden about immigration. And everyone kept saying, Tino's the guy to talk to. You've got to talk to him. And finally, we have made this happen. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. And I'm happy you were patient. And, you know, with you, since you want to interview me, I really want to do it. So I didn't say no. I just said, please, now is not the time, right? Usually I just say no.
Yeah. Well, all right, let's get right to it, because there's a lot I want to talk to you about, and there's so much misinformation generally about the immigration situation all over Europe, but it seems like Sweden seems to be like the epicenter of it. So before we dive into that, though, let's just talk about your history a little bit. So you're a Kurd originally from Iran, and now you're in Sweden.
Still a Kurd.
You're still a Kurd, right? You're still ethnically a Kurd, of course. And we've talked a bunch about the Kurds here. So just tell me a little bit about your childhood growing up. What sort of brought you from Iran to Sweden, etc.
Yes. So my parents are Kurdish, but I was born in Tehran, in the capital, which is the Persian area, and Iran. I try to simplify to Westerners. Kurds and Persians are both Iranian, but Kurds are not Persian. Just like Scots and the English are both British, but the Scots are not English. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of like the Scots are the Kurds of Europe, right? If you want, you know, so mountaineers, independent-minded, very proud people. But I grew up in Tehran and in sort of an secular, I like many Iranians. So Iran, you know, as you know very well, and maybe not every American realizes, is a very divided country, because your Americans know about the Islamists and the regime, mm-hmm. but Iran also has a very, very large group, perhaps even the majority at this point, that are really Western-oriented secular people who are oppressed by the Islamic movement. Yeah. And we are not refugees, and I've always said that from day one. We did not have reasons for asylum. We never, you know, and the reason we left, we had it also, I would say, better economically in Iran than we in Sweden, and that's not the reason we moved. It's because of freedom of speech. You want to live in a democracy. We didn't want to live in an Islamic republic. My mother had to cover herself. It's very oppressive. It's sort of, right, it violates the mind to always have to abide by this. Mm-hmm. And my father didn't want to leave Iran because he was sort of a patriot, and he was hoping that the Islamic revolution would fall with the Islamic government. But after Ayatollah Khomeini died, and all his friends left, or most of them, you know, he was American, US educated, I think he went to Sacramento, and all his friends were like that. And you know, me and my brother, we sort of grew up with the Enlightenment around us. It was never intellectually a transition for me to move from Iran to Sweden, right? I've read I've read Astrid Lindgren when I was in Iran, which is a Swedish author. Right. But anyway, all his friends left, but he didn't. He was a patriot. He wanted to stay, and he was hoping that when Khomeini died, the regime would fall or at least moderate, but it didn't happen. So then
go ahead.
Yeah, then we moved to Sweden. It was, I don't want to get into it. It was difficult. Me, my mother, and younger brother, 1 year younger. He was cited for his book on marginal revolution today, so he's also an intellectual in his own right. And we moved to Sweden. We lived there, and I studied. I grew up myself in. I lived 10 years on welfare. Grew up single mother, and grew up in the sort of housing area projects. I went to the Stockholm School of Economics for my master's degree, and then I went to the University of Chicago. Then I came back to Sweden. I was there for 1 year also for my postdoc. Then I came back to Sweden, and now I'm a researcher here. And let me emphasize that I've never done research on immigration. And that's not my area. I've done public economics, entrepreneurship. Now I'm doing historical economics, the emergence of work ethic and how important that is for why certain countries have been able to have welfare states at a larger level, to sustain it, whereas it doesn't work in other countries for cultural reasons, I would argue.
Right.
Anyway, that's my research, and this immigration debate is something that immigration is the subcategory of economics. It's not a research field in its own.
Mm-hmm.
It's a subject area, and it's part of labor and public economics and so on. But I've never done research in it because I've said that I don't philosophically believe that you should do research, empirically at least, on topics that you care a lot about.
Right.
So I prefer to cite other people.
Yeah. Okay. So let's pause there because you gave me a lot. So first off, just to be clear, so when I said I want to talk to someone about immigration, that is not specifically what you do. It's more about economics. But you're saying these things are sort of combined. I think more than anything else, people wanted me to talk to you because they're saying to me that you're one of the few people in Sweden willing to at least talk about it. So it's in a way, it's that you've been funneled to this. Yes. And you are an immigrant yourself, so we're going to get into some of the specifics, but you certainly are not against immigration in that you are a Middle Eastern immigrant to Sweden.
Sure. I mean, being against immigration is like being, if you are debating how high should taxes be and you dumb it down to, are you against taxes?
Right.
Either you want 100% tax rate or 0% tax rate, right? That's stupid. The question is, how much immigration, what type of immigration do we want, right?
Exactly. So just one other thing on your history, which I thought was interesting there. So you mentioned, so you came from a Kurdish family in Iran, but your family, did they want Kurdistan to exist separately from Iran? It sounds like they were, even though there were problems, that they...
want it. Yeah. So that's a very, very difficult question. My answer probably would no. My father probably, most of his life didn't. Toward the end of his life, he did probably, I think he changed his views on that. And it's a difficult question because I don't know how much you want to get into this, but there are Kurds largely in 4 countries. Syria, Turkey is the biggest one, then followed by Iran, Iraq, Syria. Now, the relationship between the Kurds in Iran is the one that the Kurds are most closely affiliated with the Persians. So the Kurds have to speak an Iranian language, and the movement to independence is the weakest in Iran. And it's the strongest historically in Iraq, and then the other two are now very strong as well, Turkey and Syria.
Yeah.
Iranian Kurds culturally feel closer to Persians than Kurds would feel to the Turks. The Iranians never had a genocide against the Kurds. You know, the Kurds probably, although this is not contested, originate from the Medes, who are just sort of like, it's just, if you go back 3,000 years, this was the same people. And, you know, the Greek would often refer to the Persian Empire as the Medes. So it's the famous line, where were you, how old were you, who are you, my friend, what do you do, how old were you when the Mede came, not when the Persians came.
Right.
And for these reasons, this independence movement has been weakest, and I think that even the Kurdish parties, most of them never demanded independence. They want self-rule. And my father was one of those people who was very Persified, and he believed strongly in the Iranian ideas, sort of, rather than the Kurdish. I don't. I believe in Kurdish independence. I'm a huge fan of Persian culture. I think that that's one of the world's top 10 high civilizations, and it was a great influence on the Kurds to be neighbors with the Persians. I have great respect for them. But if you ask and I know a lot of Iranians are offended by this, because Iranians are patriots. And many Iranians are even patriots before they're Muslims. But I personally believe Kurds should have an independence, and my argument, and we should be allies with Iran. And my argument is that if not else, the Islamic Republic has delegitimized them, and the Kurds would never do this. Like if the Persians would have been more liberal-minded and reasonable, maybe, but then the Persians and Azeri, they went to this radicalism, and they ruined Iran, which was between 1960 and 1970. After Japan, Iran has the highest growth rate per capita in the world.
Wow.
Right? Yeah. So it's partially oil, but not entirely oil. This is before the rise in oil prices. It's a very highly educated country. It has a tradition to 3,000 years of science and education and everything like that. And even, Iran had a constitution in the early 20th century that was more liberal than many European countries. Unfortunately, the reactionary forces were stronger, and it didn't stick, but it was close.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, to my view on that issue is that the Kurds, whatever historical relation we have, I shouldn't have to live under Islamic republics, and the Kurds would never themselves do this. This is what they did. So then that's the cause for divorce, let's say.
Right. So, okay, so we can go down that rabbit hole for the next 5 hours if we want, but I just wanted to ask you that because we've talked a bit about the Kurds, and I know it's so complex because of being split with all these countries and all that. Okay, so you moved to Sweden when you're 9 years old. You mentioned you were on welfare for 10 years with a single mother. So that really gets to the heart, I think, of what's happening in Sweden now. Sweden has incredibly good social services, right? And that's why all these immigrants want to come there. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Oh, sure. So Sweden and the other Scandinavian countries have the spending as a share, social spending as a share of the economy is among the highest in the world, together with France. These are the highest countries. And Sweden has become less generous in recent years. It's not quite the utopia that Bernie Sanders or Paul Krugman imagines. And Paul Krugman specifically says that his ideal society is Sweden 1980, not Sweden today. And in part, of course, Paul Krugman would perhaps not acknowledge this, but it's because of the immigration. They just can't afford. But anyway,
that's an important distinction, though, because you're taking a homogeneous society, bringing in all these people, giving them a lot. It worked at that point, 1980 or whatever it was, and now you're seeing the change. So we shouldn't gloss over that.
No, you should. I'm going to get to it.
Yeah.
I'm just going to go to how generous it is. But it's not the only cause. I mean, the public student, it's also reasons having to do with the structural change perhaps in the economy that in 1980, you had more of a big corporations, you could have an innovation economy based around big corporations, and Sweden always had those, and those carried. Sweden was, as Milton Friedman pointed out when he was in Sweden in 1958, I believe, it's always been a capitalist society. It's a capitalist society with a lot of free enterprise and very, very generous regulation on business, very free market, but very high taxes and redistributes it. So that's the key. Anyway, it's not a socialist country at all, and American libertarians or conservatives should never say that, because that's going to make people falsely attribute the success of Sweden. Sweden never had central planning. Private business was always private. Right?
So that's a really interesting distinction, because I think people think of it as, Bernie wants to turn America into Sweden, and Sweden is working, and there's a socialist component. But what you're saying is it's really capitalist, and the businesses are free to do what they want, but people are taxed very high, and that's how you deal with the social safety net. And that's a real distinction there.
Yes, that's completely right. And Bernie wants to make the U.S. into Sweden, and a lot of Swedish politicians want to make Sweden into Mexico.
We're going to have to get a chart.
Yeah. Anyway, so for example, I think if you are a small family and you don't work, the Swedish government is going to give you something equivalent to $2,000 a month.
Wow.
In welfare. That's high. You have free healthcare, free college, free schooling. Well, free schooling you have in the U.S. too, but still. And free daycare, almost free. Well, if you're poor, it's free. If you're not poor, it's almost free. All these things are tax financed. And of course, this means that the typical laborer will tax 55 on average % of their income in total, including sales tax. Wow. And a rich person, maybe even 70%.
Wow.
To fund this. But it's still, to this day, 97% of Swedes support social safety net. It's very strong popular support, and however, this attracts immigrants. It's not the only thing that attracts immigrants, by the way. Immigrants would come, I should say, even if this didn't exist, just because Sweden is wealthy. Because as long as you have wages or earning in India or Africa or parts of the Middle East, when people earn $1,000 a year, something like that, even if coming and begging in Sweden is maybe better than that.
Right.
But of course, this attracts, and what's happened is that this system worked when 85 to 90% of working age adults worked. That's also a key of Sweden, more than the US, by the way. However, among the non-European immigrants, half of them working age don't work. And you could fund the Swedish welfare state when 85% work, full participation. You can't fund it if this share of the population that, first of all, doesn't work. And if they work, they typically earn 20-30% less because they're more in low-skilled labor and so on. Traditionally, the Social Democrats in Sweden, Norway, Denmark, they realized this, they articulated this. They said, look, we can have a welfare state, folkhem, as they call it. We can have a folkhem for 8 million Swedes. We can afford that. We can't afford it for 1 billion or 5 billion poor people.
Right.
And therefore, these countries have very, very restrictive immigration, that was accepted. But what happened later on is that this became associated with racism, and there is an idea among many Swedes, both the libertarian, sort of bleeding heart libertarians and the socialist, cultural socialists, where the idea is racist to say I want to exclude somebody because they happen not to be born in Sweden. And this is a conflict that's tearing a country apart.
Yeah, and we see this all over Europe right now, and we're seeing the beginnings of it in America. And that's why I've been talking about this issue, because I see this conversation we're not having it in any sort of effective way here. And I see all these people in Europe, and why people wanted me to talk to you and talk about Sweden, because you guys are dealing with this right now. So when did that creeping idea of political correctness, when did that really start for you guys?
That's a very difficult question. Look, a lot of people would say 1968 is when this was exploded, but then it was a huge lag before it transformed into policy. And perhaps you could. 1968, there was because of Vietnam, by the way. So the American, in my opinion, excessive foreign policy indirectly caused this, and it destroyed a lot of goodwill that existed toward the U.S. and toward the right, for no end. Anyway, so what happened is that this caused huge student movement. You had a rise of communism, and a lot of the intellectual elite in Europe, particularly in these North European countries and France, became Marxist to various degrees. They were not usually pro-Soviet, because that was also considered a mean country. But a lot of the Swedish journalists today are either still openly Marxist-Leninists, or they used to when they were young. I don't want to talk about it. And then this gradually, there was also another shift. Sweden used to have a strong. Sweden is a very egalitarian country, which I appreciate. They have egalitarian norms. Ronald Reagan said this too, that real equality is being equal in the eyes of each other. It's a cultural thing. It's not just about economics. Obviously, if you have too much economic inequality, that's going to destroy social inequality too.
Sure.
But the core of it is not money, right? It's sort of having respect for each other and values, not to humiliate people, status hierarchy and things like that. This was a very small, as you mentioned, homogeneous society, small nobility. Northern Europe, Scandinavia, was the only part of Europe that never had serfdom, that the peasants were always free. These cultural traits remained. And then they had a strong labor movement, but not that much polarization. It's not the Soviet Union when they're trying to kill each other, right?
Right.
And there was a consensus in Swedish society. So there was a consensus to build a welfare state. The word folkhemmet was originally articulated by the right wing, in fact, not by the left. Yeah.
Interesting.
And then the Social Democrats, the centrist elements were anti-Marxist. Those were union people, basically, unions, who wanted this welfare state, but they liked industry. See, that's a big difference between Sweden and US. In the US, you are pro-freedom, pro-markets. You don't like business. Swedes love business.
Right.
They love big business, but they don't necessarily like capitalism.
Right.
Anyway, these people had a moderate, pragmatic views. They restricted immigration, and to this day, these hardcore sort of old school social democrats, they're against this. My readers, to a large extent, are these people. So it's bipartisan in that sense. See that these old right and left issues have shifted because the dimension has shifted. What happened is you had the cultural left ascendants. These were usually not working class people. I think they were bourgeoisie or upper class, sort of champagne left. Yeah. They did not care that much about the working class issues. That's the workers are unwashed masses anyway. They have reactionary views. They like to drink. Al Bundy does not appeal to them. Their issues were more post-Marxist issues of gender, multiculturalism, racial issues, sort of post-colonialism, and a lot of it imported because Sweden at the time did not have a colonial heritage. It did not have really any racial diversity.
Right.
But they would, follow the debate in the U.S. at large other European countries, and they mimic those ideas.
So that's really interesting. You guys had a homogeneous society, basically.
Yes.
Obviously, there was some immigration, but then sort of these bougie, what now I refer to and what we've been saying in the States a lot is this regressive left ideology came in, and they started importing. It was as if they were importing an idea of a problem more than the problem itself. I mean, that's really fascinating.
That is true, and it's to this day. And they use American lingo in ways that make no sense. But for example, and of course, the Swedes are not that good at innovating these post-feminist, the post-Marxist ideas, post-structuralism, but they're really good at importing it and what do you mean? Absorbing it. So, for example, they use the word. Do you have racified? That's, you have to go deep into post-colonial studies department in the U.S., but they use it all the way. Your racified means if you're, let's say, if I'm not a Kurd, but I am Kurd because you think I'm a Kurd. You have racified me as a minority, right? That's one thing that they usually use the word Uncle Tom, and I often tell them, look, Kurds were not brought to Sweden as slaves. I don't know if you identify as the Swedes as your slave owners, but I don't. So saying Uncle Tom really doesn't make sense when you don't have slavery.
Right.
And they use a lot of American, without translating it. They just say the American word in English without really reflecting it either. It's like two legs bad, four legs good, sort of thing.
Right.
And anyway, then another element of Sweden, though, it's just not that the leftism. Swedes are very sheltered. They're very kind, tolerant, sort of damaged by peace and affluence. And they had guilt. They had guilt watching on television that they were affluent and you had wars all over the world. And they start to bring refugees. Initially, few. And initially, it was always believed, maybe as the U.S., why are you making a fuss? It's just 5,000 people. It's just 10,000 people. And of course, okay, but what happens if it's 10,000 a year and then each person has one or two family reunification and you do it for 4 years, then you end up where you end up, right? And anyway, and they did that not really. There was never like an idea, of course, saying, let's make this country multi-ethnic. We don't like this homogeneity. And to this day, if you tell the Swedish left this immigration policy is going to cause Sweden, ethnic Swedes, to become the minority, they will scream and yell and say that's not true, and that's you're Hitler or you're whatever. And this math, okay, no,
yeah,
it's very funny. They just, it's just like Crime Stop. They just shut up thinking. Anyway, so it started in the 80s. Is when non-European immigration started. So if you go back to World War II, before World War II, 1% were immigrants, overwhelmingly from other Western European countries. As late as 1990, only 3% were non-Western immigrants. Now, maybe total 23% at this point have foreign origin.
Wow, that's an incredible difference.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
Of those, still about maybe 10 percentage points are Western European or European, and 13 percentage points maybe are non-Western. But Sweden has had both the highest rate of refugees per capita in the West. Some years you will have Hungary or Malta superseding, but they're not giving them asylum. That doesn't count. These are just transit countries.
Right.
Moreover, a number I usually tell Swedes is that Sweden has long surpassed the U.S. record as net immigration and the share of the population. In the U.S. record is around 1880 during the transatlantic migration. We are taking far more than that per year. And of course, in absolute numbers, it's 160,000, 163,000 last year. Well, the absolute numbers, sure, that's less than Germany, although that's the only country that takes more than Sweden is Germany.
Right, and they have plenty of problems right now.
Yeah, and Sweden has 10 million people. They have 82 million people. You have to look at the population of Sweden.
Right.
Let me give you another number I like. Sweden has 1.9% of the European Union population. Last year, 40% of unaccompanied minors. This is extreme. This is an extreme country. By the way, I should really emphasize this. This has stopped. The Swedish government last year says there is no limit. If a few months into the asylum crisis, they say, we are not going to put barbed wire around Sweden. They're rambling in the parliament about fascism and Auschwitz. A few days before they close the borders, the migration minister says, if we close the borders, that could create a chain reaction that destabilizes the Balkan. They have also these delusional ideas of how important they are. And they do it. Then they cut a refugee inflow since they closed the border by 95%, unaccompanied minors by 99%. So now Sweden is, if at this moment, if they continue this, we don't know, because there are voices on the left saying, well, the crisis is averted, let's open the borders again. But if they continue this, it could actually be averted. So, it's no longer open borders in Sweden.
Right. So, okay. So when it was open borders, did that mean that anyone who showed up at the border could just, A, walk across, and B, immediately get asylum, get these social services, and basically become a citizen?
You asked 3 questions. Yeah. They could walk across, yes.
Okay.
They could get social welfare, yes. They could not become stay here. So let me explain something that I think is very important to understand about the European refugee crisis, both for Americans and Europeans. It's really very simple. What you have to understand is the way Europeans and Americans regulate refugee asylum is a refugee that sets foot on your border has the right by the Geneva Convention to apply for asylum. And if they have ground for asylum, for example, war, basically you have to give them asylum. Okay. But they have no rights until the moment they set foot across the border and they need a visa to enter the country. And these countries do not give. To this day, Germany will not give a visa. Merkel does not give visas to Syrians in Syria. They have to penetrate the border, okay? And historically, you had border crossings. You had to pay, you have to pay smugglers, somehow trick yourself in. Then you go apply for asylum. If you have ground for asylum, you can stay. Of course, if you just go from Gambia, they probably will not let you stay unless you find a loophole.
Right.
Okay. What happened is that this country has very strict border controls, and it's like a tanker. In Sweden's case, you have to cross Denmark, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Greece, Turkey.
Yeah.
Few people could do that, so you could have very generous ground for giving asylum, like giving it to somebody like me who didn't have the right, really, logically to get. But there are very few who could make it. Then with the European Union and Schengen, they disassembled these border controls. They had an internal border, and they outsourced it to Greece and Turkey. Then last year, this broke down because the Greeks stopped enforcing it. The countries in the Central Europe stopped enforcing it, the border controls. They could have chosen to do it, but they chose not to. And the Turks probably, Erdogan let them through, or that's not important to get into that detail. Yeah. For the first time in human history, there was a land route between Sweden and the Middle East. Right. So you could sit on a bus, basically simplifying it, from Afghanistan or Tehran, where most Afghans, by the way, came from Iran, not from Afghanistan, or Iraq, Syria, and you take a bus, you come to Sweden, and you apply for asylum. Once this happened, it just kept snowballing until these countries, one by one, closed the border back, then it stopped. And all this time, obfuscating and using lies and misdirection to not make people understand why this has happened. See, that's if people understood, you could have always in Sweden, the government, both the right and the left, and the immigration department, they would officially go on TV and say international law prohibits us to close the borders. I'm not saying that, but on the other hand, we could impose border controls. It doesn't prevent us from doing that, and that would close the borders. We're not telling you that because you're dumb voters. We don't want you to know these details.
Right. So that gets to the heart of why I've been talking about this, that it seems to me no one's having an honest discussion about it. No one's having an honest discussion over what the system in any of these given countries, as you're saying, what the system can tolerate, what the system can do. Germany let in something like 1.3 million people. Obviously, I don't think Merkel was intending some evil plan to have immigrants take over the country.
Well, you have willful ignorance.
So then there's a lot of people with willful ignorance, and then there's these leftists that, as I keep saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. They have this, they think they're doing something good, and then at the same time, they're destroying the very systems that allow them to live the way they want to live.
That's true. Everything you say is true, and this is a lot of it is about misdirected altruism and oxytocin poisoning and so on. But I do believe there is a darker side to this story as well. And let me try to articulate it.
Yeah.
I think this is comparative compassion. It's not true compassion. Because I always said, the question is not should we help the refugees, it's how do we help them most effectively. And my suggestion is for every dollar or kroner we cut on taking refugees in Sweden, we give 2 to the UN program. So I want to double how much we spend on this, but doing it in a way that actually solves the problem at the macro level, not just symbolically. You take a few thousand people, many of whom don't need the help and are economic refugees, sort of using this, not to moralize.
Right.
I understand they're doing it, but they would not die. So a close approximation, nobody would have. Sweden did not save one life. Wait, why do people do this? I think this is the mechanism. The mechanism is they're trying to upend other people in their own societies. They want to show them, I'm more altruistic than you are. Therefore, I'm a better person, and they bully each other. Mm-hmm. That's where you're getting a lot of hate coming out from them. You're not seeing a lot of love. And that includes Merkel, by the way. They're using like this kind of very, very false racist accusation, lying constantly. Good people don't need to lie.
Yeah.
Why they do this brown smearing? They try to use insinuation. Everybody that sees a parallel between Afghans who live in Tehran and decide they want to have higher quality of life in Sweden and the Holocaust, mm-hmm. that person is dishonest, because a logical person would understand that is not the parallel. But another example is Alan Kurdi, who was a 3-year-old child who died, mm-hmm. right? And these pictures is what caused it. Let's look at this story. So this is a child who grew up in Turkey, had protection in Turkey, and their family openly say they moved to the West to have better economic conditions. That openly say that, and they did not drown or die running away from Syria. They drowned moving from Turkey to Greece. And by the way, about 1,500 more people have drowned since that. 300 more children, by the way. Mm-hmm. And people reacted by not asking, so why did this child die? The answer is because the European libertarians and the European left, they incentivized that child's family to take a risk to cross the Mediterranean to get higher quality of life. That's why the child died. Yeah. Okay, and they create a death lottery when they say if you cross the Mediterranean, you make it, you can have a higher quality of life, but you have a 0.3 probability of dying. But I'm not going to give you a visa so you can safely fly here. I'm not going to do that.
Right.
Then you call too many of you. But I'll incentivize a system where more and more people drown. In 2010, 20 people drowned in the Mediterranean. Right. Last year, 4,000 people drowned in the Mediterranean. It's 9/11, 9/11 a year.
Yeah, and then when you couple, you take a country like Greece, which has massive economic problems right now, you can understand why, you see these videos every few weeks now of migrants coming in boats, and then you have the Greek Navy they're either shooting at the boats or they're trying to get them away, and it's like, you don't want those people to die, and then at the same time, the Greek system is struggling to stand on its own. Yeah, so it's just so complex.
The Australians solved it. If you come in this way, there is no way you give you asylum. End of story. Then you remove the incentive. Then we discuss how you can help them. And let's all be adults and understand there is no war in Turkey. At least maybe there is a small-scale war far apart, has nothing to do with this, with the Kurdish issue. But in these areas, there is no war. Nobody is crossing the Mediterranean, is running from grenades, okay? They're already in safety. The question is then, how do you deal with this? And let's look at some of these numbers. It's like Sweden is spending something like, only on initial taking the refugees, $10 billion a year.
Wow.
The entire UN budget for all the refugees that actually is something like $5 billion. So Sweden is spending twice as much on 0.3% of the refugees than the UN has.
Wow.
Bernie Sanders and these guys like to talk about the 1%, 99%. That's a bigger disparity.
Right, that's a much bigger disparity.
And by the way, this 0.3% probably you're not saving their life. What you're doing is rather than live in Turkey or rather than live in Iran or a lot of other countries or that are not really have war, or there are some like Iraq, even Iraq is not full-scale war. Rather than living there, they live in Western Europe. That's what's doing. You're not saving their lives. in both Sweden and Finland, a lot of the refugees have left. And they say, we are displeased, it takes too long, it's not what we expected, the quality of life. Fair enough. But that tells you something, right?
Yeah.
If somebody, voluntarily goes back because they just say, I'm not happy with the quality of living, well, that person probably was not desperately running for their life, like people imagine. And then the question becomes this thing, what you say, are these good intentions? I would say at some deep level they're not. This is like you want to pretend to do well, and maybe you convince yourself, but deep down what you're trying to do is you're trying to raise your own status and sort of push your own ideology and ideas on your surrounding. Otherwise, you would have a rational debate.
Yeah.
If you genuinely want to help people, why are you refusing to discuss it rationally?
Well, that's what people on the left seem to be doing all the time now. We're calling it virtue signaling, that they want you to think that they're so virtuous, so we can help everybody. I was on a radio show with a guy, and he was telling me how he would be for everybody can come to America all the time. And all I said basically was, well, I just would like to know at the border that we're vetting people properly and blah, blah, blah. And he was jumping all over me as if that made me racist. And what I was trying to do is exactly what you said, which is let's have an honest discussion about this. I understand that my great-grandparents were immigrants, so I would always err on the side of immigrants, but we have to make sure our system works.
Well, let me say something about that, though. If your great-grandparents were immigrants, let me change the frame. And America took them. Don't you have an even greater obligation to this country than somebody who was, by the way,
right? So it's just you can look at it either way, but yeah.
Yeah, but you were talking about that. There is a quote. Probably there is no evidence Churchill said it, but it's a great quote anyway, which is the fascist of the future will appear as anti-fascist. That's what happened, and there is a great deal of anger and intolerance in this ideology. But I would, by the way, one thing I don't agree with what you say is that the left. That's debatable. I think that. Depends how you define it. I think you see the same thing with the libertarians. In both the US and in Europe, the libertarian right, in here at least, and I know some of them in Europe, the Ayn Rand crowd, they are even more nuts than the Marxists.
Yeah, it's funny. Just 2 weeks ago, I had the president of the Ayn Rand Institute, and unfortunately, we didn't get much into immigration. But our libertarian movement here is not, it's very fractured.
It's fractured, I know. You have a big variety, fracture there, and you have the sort of patriot libertarians, paleo libertarians, I know.
Yeah.
But still, they've done a lot of damage with these unscientific ideas that immigration is always good, it can never be bad for economy, and you cannot, it's interesting, it's sort of proto-Marxist idea is people do not have the moral right not to have immigration, even if they hurt, as long as you raise the global utility. That's a very common idea among the libertarian economists. Wait a second. That's a Marxist idea, that if I can prove that redistribution makes everybody, me more better off than it hurts you, I have the right to take your goods. It's very interesting that they have, and what they do, by the way, is they cheat. They try to pretend that their ideas are coherent by distorting reality. Like claiming that immigration is always good for economy, which is not true.
Yeah.
It's never been true. Or claiming that it's not going to lead to social problem, it doesn't raise crime. That's how they get around to these dilemmas. They just lie about it.